Good morning. My name is Chris Drozdowski. I'm with OriginLab Technical Support. I'll be hosting today's webinar on creating reports with HTML and Markdown. I'd like to note that this is a re-recording of a webinar we originally presented in June of 2020. We had some issues with the audio during that webinar, so we decided to re-record it to post on our website. All right, let's get started with the webinar, creating reports with HTML and Markdown. Origin's history with reports is somewhat limited. Within the product, when we performed an analysis, we typically got a report sheet like the one you see here. It's got a lot of information, very comprehensive, pretty much everything you'd like to know about that analysis. However, exporting that report out of Origin was never easy, and it was also a little bit difficult to customize this report completely. Many customers wanted a more customized report. So several versions ago, we also added the ability to export report information to a Microsoft Word document. And more recently, after demand from customers and internally, we've added the ability to create reports using HTML. So let's take a look at those today. We'll look at a couple of examples because we have two different flavors of HTML report. One is full HTML. You can see an example here. It's nicely styled. We have a table of parameters for a peak fitting. We have the graph with the fitted peaks, and we have a table of information about each peak. And this is the full HTML style report. But we have a simpler report based on a simpler syntax in HTML called Markdown. It allows you to create a very similar report, but much simpler. And this can be more friendly for someone who isn't familiar with HTML, because Markdown syntax, as we'll see in a moment, is pretty simple. In fact, let's move on and look at Markdown syntax. But before I go any further, let me point out how the container, how a report is started. Our HTML reports are contained in our notes window. We can create a new one from the toolbar, a new notes. It comes in blank. These are traditionally used for holding plain text, just whatever you want to put in it, whatever kind of notes. It's typically only text. However, for our HTML reports, we can come to what we call the title bar of the window. This is the title bar of this notes window, and right-click and choose syntax. And we have three syntaxes. One is text. That's a traditional just text. We set it to HTML if we want to put HTML content in this notes window for our report, or we set it for Markdown if we want Markdown content in this report. So that's how we're going to initially set up the container for the HTML report. And I'll go ahead and delete this notes since we don't need it. And here I have a notes window. The syntax is set to Markdown, and we're looking at how you specify Markdown. This comes from a website called the Markdown cheat sheet, and we can see that we have our headings are usually started with the hash, the pound character, and we can have different numbers of pound characters to indicate different heading levels. Let me go ahead and show you how we can go from this code view, we're coding now, to where we can look at the actual rendered Markdown. And that's easy to do. We'll just use a Control-M keyboard shortcut. And when we do, we can see the basic elements of Markdown that are available. And I'll go back to the code in a minute, but we have headings, we have bold, italic, a table, block quotes, and either unordered or ordered lists. These are the typical elements you're going to need in an Origin Markdown report. I'm going to go back to the code by hitting Control-M, and in this notes window we can see the bold. Typically, a bold and italics are specified using surrounding asterisks. 2 for bold, 1 for italic. We can see an example of our table, and we can see an example of the different markdowns for the block quote and the unordered and ordered lists. We are going to make this project available along with the webinar recording. So if you're curious about this, you will have this Markdown syntax available to you via the project. So that's Markdown. Let me go back, Control M, to look at the render mode. Okay, now let's move on and look at HTML syntax. And here I have a notes window. I'll right click and look at the syntax. It is set to HTML. Uh, for those that are familiar with HTML, this is just generic HTML5. For those that are unfamiliar with HTML, it's not hard to learn. You can teach yourself rather quickly. And as I said, this project will be included with the webinar, so you will have this available. You can actually use this template right here. This is a bare bones HTML page ready to put some content in this body. But let's go back to this example because I have a few things, some headers and paragraphs and a bold text and italics text. I switched to render mode with Control M, and we can see how it looks. It's very similar to the Markdown example I just provided. Again, Control M to go back to my code view. And let's move on for our next topic. We're going to talk about adding graphs and tables. I mean, the idea of an HTML report, as we see here, is to add graphs and tables. And we do that by creating links from the original source, from an origin graph or maybe a report table. And we're going to look and see how we can make one of these. Let me go ahead and delete these. These are ones I made previously. We won't need them. I'll delete this one, and I will delete this one. And let's start with a Markdown example. I have a report here, and this is what I want to put in my Markdown. I want to pull a table from this report, and I want to put this graph in. So let's start a new notes window. I will set the syntax to Markdown. I'm going to give it a header, 1 pound for the largest header, and I'll just call it my report. Add a couple of new lines. One of the things with Markdown is you differentiate sections, for example, a table or a graph or a paragraph with 2 carriage returns. And we'll come into my report sheet from Origin. And I am going to copy this table here. This is a parameters table. Observe how I do this. I come into my upper left cell, click once to select it, right click, and choose Copy Table Text. Again, right click on the cell, Copy Table Text. Then I'm coming over to my report, and you can do this either with Markdown or HTML. The behavior is the same. I'll put my caret where I want the table. I will right click, and I will choose Paste Link. Not paste, you want Paste Link. This is going to create a link to that table. Let's switch to render mode and see what it did. See, we can see the tables now in our Markdown report. Go back. Now let's add a graph. We want to use this graph, and rather than right click on the graph to copy it or go from the edit menu, we're just going to use a keyboard shortcut Control-C to copy. Your keyboard copy shortcut. And we'll go back to our report. Again, like we did with that table, we're going to paste link. And when I do, you can see, similar to how the table created this code, this block of code, Origin pasted a block of code representing a graph. And let's hit Control M to go into render mode. We can see our table, and now we see our graph. What if we don't like this width? What if we want it a little bit wider? We can also, by the way, double click in render mode to go back to the code editing mode. Let's set our width of this graph a little wider, and we do that on this right side where we see 400. Let's raise it to 600 and hit Control M. we can see that the graph has gotten larger. Now let's go ahead and do the same thing with HTML. I'm going to minimize my Markdown report. I am going to create a new notes window, right click, set the syntax to HTML. And let me go back one folder. I will simply copy that template I had. I'll come here, Control A to select all, Control C to copy that HTML. Come back to the folder for adding graphs and tables and paste it into my HTML report. Now I can do the same thing in the HTML code. I go to my linear fit report, select the upper left cell, click one time, right click, copy table text. I come into the body element of my HTML. I'll give myself a carriage return. Right click and choose paste link. Control M to render mode. We have something very similar to the Markdown. Go back out of render mode. Now let's add a graph. Again, I'll activate my graph. Again, I'll hit Control C to copy. I'll come to my report. I will right click, paste link. And now I render it and we can see the graph. Make it a little bit wider. There we go. Now let's take a look at one thing. Just this isn't real important, but you might observe it if you work with HTML and Markdown. Let me bring back my Markdown report. Let me get out of render mode. We can see how those code snippets that Origin pasted in for the table and the graph. The table one is the same between Markdown and HTML. However, the graph code is somewhat different with Markdown than HTML. In HTML, we go ahead and we use an image element. Again, we can specify our width. So that's how we can add tables and graphs to a report. Let's look at the next segment here. How about adding individual cells from, for example, a report sheet? I have an HTML example of adding cells and I have a Markdown. And they're both going to be tables. We created a Markdown table, if you'll remember the Markdown syntax that I talked about earlier. And we created an HTML table. We had to create this table by hand. And I'll explain why we added what's called a class to this table in just a moment. Well, first let's show you how we're going to do it in Markdown. How we're going to show individual cells. Let's scroll down to the statistics table in our linear fit report, and we're looking for Pearson's R. So we will come down, find our Pearson's R with the value cell, single select it, right click, copy, and copy it. Then we'll come into our Markdown table. I'll put my cursor where I want it, right click and choose paste link. And we get a new syntax here. Origin's created a new type of code. It's what's called a cell link. We've got those surrounded by double braces. It looks sort of like a URL, but it's a URL to a cell. Let's render it real quick and look. So now we have a value there. We'll get out of rendering. And unfortunately, it looks like I've added R square twice. So what we will do is we will choose residual sum of squares. Let's do that, the RSS. And now we need the RSS value. Come to the cell, right click, copy, come to my Markdown, find the right position, paste link. And I got it slightly out. I got it slightly in the wrong space there, but we can fix that easily. And finally, let's look at the R square COD. Again, go back to my report sheet in the workbook, right click, copy, come in, add a little space here. So we're sure we're within those pipe characters that delineate the table. And we'll choose paste link. Render it. We can see that now we have this Markdown table, and you'll observe something. We tried to emulate the same theme that's in our worksheet reports into our HTML and Markdown reports. So that's the Markdown. Let's look at it and see how we do it in the HTML. Again, I have a table. I manually created it. The reason I added this class attribute to the table is so that it would create yellow headers. Without that, we would not have those yellow headers. So we need Pearson's R. We're going to need the residual sum of squares. Again, I need to fix that. And we have the R square COD. So let's go in with Pearson's R, copy it, come into my TD. In HTML, the data cell is a TD element. So I'm going to come into this empty TD and paste a link. I'll do the same thing for the RSS and the R squared. Copy, paste into my TD element, paste link, pardon me. Finally, for the R square, copy cell, paste into TD element. Paste link, pardon me. It's always paste link, it's never paste. That's very important. Hit Control M to render, and we can see how we've created another table based on cell links. And because I added that origin table class to my table element, I get these nice yellow backgrounds on my row headers in this case. So that's how we can add cells. Thus far, we've learned how to add tables, graphs, and now cells. And let's look at one more thing we can add, and it will help to introduce a new concept to you, adding variables. And let me explain what I've done here, because we don't see a report. What we have done is we have embedded our report into the workbook, and I'll show you how we do that. A report is in this Notes 4 tab. It's in its own worksheet, and I can double click it to activate my report. I have some Markdown here. I'll explain these in just a minute. Let me show you how I arrived at putting this report into a workbook. And this will be an important concept in just a minute when we talk about analysis templates. So I want to add a notes sheet to my workbook. This is just a generic workbook. I've got some imported data here. I will come down to the tab that holds the name of the worksheet. I will right click on that tab and choose Add Notes as Sheet. And it added a note sheet. Again, I come to that tab, right click, and Add Notes as Sheet. So I have what we call a note sheet here. You can't see anything while it's still in the workbook. In fact, we like to use the term parking, like parking a car. We've parked this notes window into this worksheet. To view the contents of that notes window or to interact with it, we have to double click. And when we do, we get a pop-up notes window where we can add our HTML and our Markdown. I'm not going to do that with this particular one. It was more about showing you that concept of creating a notes sheet container for our report in our workbook. Well, let's go back to the original one I created, Notes 4, and activate it. The reason we embedded, that's another term, embedded this notes window into that workbook is we're going to pull out information about the import, that data import into this worksheet. We have variables available about the import, and we can see them here. Maybe here's an example of one: the path and file name of the current project. That's one. That's a series of variables that are available. A formatted file date for the file that was imported. Maybe a path to the user files folder. A default imported file date, and the name of the imported file. I'm going to hit Control M so we can see what these variables are. And it's hard to explain. Maybe it's hard to see during the webinar. what these are. That's why after the webinar, we're making this project available. You can come back and look at these. For example, one of these variables we can define as a string variable. It looks like a URL that begins with str. And in this case, I have string registers that hold the various values, and this is the path and file name of the current project. Those are string registers. I've brought them together. I've concatenated them together, which is something you can do when you have a string variable. We can also have a string variable where we've pulled the import file date. Page info is this structure that's stored inside a workbook when you import into it, and you have various values. You've got page info system import file date, file name, file path. There's a number of them, and we have those in our documentation. If you want to read up, in this case, I can use what's called a string variable. And when I have a string variable, I can actually set an expression for it, not just a value. I can create an expression. For example, I have a LabTalk function date to string, and I can take this import file date, which currently looks just like a number. It's numeric. I can add a date format to it, and Origin will render that as a date. Let's take a quick look. Control M. This is that customized date that code just showed. Control M to go back. We can also find our user files folder. That's a string variable, and it points to the %y string register. Now we have another notation called var for variable. It's again with that URL-like format. It begins with var. And we showed a customized file import date above, but we also have a default one. We'll take a look at that. This is the default, how the default import file date would render. Finally, we have a variable for the file name. Now the variables that are strings, like a file name, they always end with a $sign. That's a LabTalk thing. If you've used any LabTalk and string variables, you're familiar with the idea of adding a $sign to the end of the variable name. So this is how we can include various variables that are related to data in a workbook and its importation, or variables such as your user files folder or the project path and file name. Those are the variables. And if you'll remember, just to refresh you, I embedded this report into the workbook. Now let's take a look at the next topic. Let's take a minute and talk about analysis templates. We're going to build on what we just talked about embedding an HTML report. And I'm not going to go too much into analysis templates and batch processing here. We're going to stay focused on these HTML reports. We have plenty of documentation and other webinars that discuss batch processing. But let's say you built an analysis template. You've imported some data. You created a graph, which, by the way, you can embed, just like we embed the notes window in a workbook. You can embed a graph. I've embedded a graph. Let me double click to activate. We can see that it's a Gaussian shaped peak, and we performed a nonlinear curve fit on it. And I will minimize, I'll park that back in the workbook since we've seen it. We have a fitting report here. So we have our fitting report and we have our graph, and we want to assemble that into a report. Let's take a look first at what the report will look like. I've already done one, and I've already embedded it into the workbook. So this is our report. Our report is going to have a table of informational variables, such as the data set, the file, the model. It's going to have a graph, and it's going to have our parameters table. It's very simple, but it's a good example. So we have our table, graph, parameters table. And this is going to be our HTML. Just to make things simple, I'm going to actually, I can also, by the way, I can also take an existing notes window and embed it into the workbook. So I've got an existing notes window. I already have my table for that top table with the variables, data set, file name. I've already got it pre-made for our webinar. I can have the table and the graph, but let's pop this right into this workbook. I just come down to one of these tabs, right click, and this time, I guess I can't do it this time, and that's okay. I'm just going to add a new note sheet, and I'll activate it and just copy this over. Control A, Control C, Control V. I've copied it over. I need to remember to set the render mode. I'll come to the window title bar, right click, pardon me, the syntax, not the render mode. Go to syntax and HTML. So first thing I'm going to do is I need to add cell links for the dataset, date, file, model, adjusted R square. I'll go to my report in my workbook and let me find these various values. Let's see, our data set. We're going to come to import data, and I'm going to choose this range to the Y data. I'll click on the cell, right click, choose copy, come to my report to that TD element, paste link. File. We need to find the file. Let's see where it is on here. I'm not sure we have the file in here, but what we can do is we can go back and copy one of those variables. Let me hop back over to the variables and choose the name of the import. We want this name of the imported file. So I'll hit Control M to come back to the code view and just Control C to copy that. Come back to my analysis template. And what has happened is Origin by default, when you switch folders, it closes any open graph or any open notes from the workbook. So I need to double click to activate that again. And I come to file name and I will paste that here into the TD. This is an interesting TD because it's specified to span 3 columns. We'll see that's effect. So I will choose paste there. It should have been paste link, but that'll work. No, it was paste, pardon me. I need the model. Let's go back to our report and choose our fitting model. It's Gauss amp. Select the cell, right click, copy. Model, go into the TD element, paste link. Finally, we need our adjusted R square. So let's scroll down to our statistics. Do our adjusted R square, select a cell, right click, copy. Come over, paste link. Okay. Now let's take a look. Let's take a look and see what we have here. Let me just fit. Okay, we're good here. Okay, so we did not get the data set. We got the date and the data set mixed up, and we can fix that. This is a good example of making a mistake and then correcting it. All right, so we need to move the data set code. I'll just Control X to cut it and paste it in the right TD this time and find my date in the report. This will be the date the report ran, and that's at the very top at the operation time. Select cell, right click, copy, come down on my TD, the right one this time, and paste link. Let me clean it up a bit. So we have our top table. Now we need to add a graph to this report that's associated with this analysis template. I'm going to activate my graph. Again, I'm going to hit, since it's a graph, there's really no menu for me to copy. I'm just going to use Control C. Come below my table. I'll give myself a new line there, a carriage return, paste link to generate that graph element. I'm going to set the width a little bit wider. I already know ahead of time I do want that wide. That 600 seems like a pretty good width. Finally, we need to put the parameters table into our report. I'll go back to my nonlinear curve fit report. I found my parameters table. Again, I select that top left cell, click on it one time, right click, and choose copy table text. Don't use copy table HTML. That's for a totally different purpose. We want copy table text. Come over to my report, right click, and paste link. Now let's look at our rendered report. Okay, we have all the elements we want. We have that top table, we have a graph, and we have our parameters. We can now put this back, park it back into the workbook. And what we'll do in the future, if once we say this is an analysis template, and if we want multiple copies, we can do batch processing. We don't want to delete the intermediate books. We want to keep those intermediate books when we do batch processing, because each book will have its Origin knows how to keep up with links, and each book with different data set will have its own report. So that's how we do analysis templates. The important concept being you're embedding, you're parking that HTML report in the same workbook as your analysis template. Let's look at a couple more subjects for today. Let's look at styling a report. If you will recall, let's see if I have the pre-styled report here. You'll observe that is the analysis template we created. I had just duplicated it prior to the webinar. And let's see, okay, we're still at the same state. We've still got our default styling where the table's headers are yellow and we just have generic fonts, nothing special here. But what if we want to make it nice? What if we want to make it look like in our original examples? I'll go back. What if we want to make it look like this? Some nice, more attractive tables. Well, I'll show you how we can do that. And this is somewhat more complex topic than simply Markdown or HTML or anything we've covered so far. When we have a table, let me reactivate that report. The way we style things in modern times for HTML is we use something called cascading style sheets. It is, or CSS, and it's a different syntax. It allows us to specify for a given element things like colors, fonts, borders, sizes, margins, paddings, just a huge number of different options. And I have a set of styles that will style these tables to be that blue you just saw. I've included, and this is included in this project, all the styles you need. I'll show you how to use them for a minute. I will attempt to, at some point soon, create a blog post where I'll make a number of different styles available. So you have more than just this blue. Maybe you have a yellow one or a green one or an orange one, just different styles. By the way, and I'm not going to cover this today. Well, I'll go on a tangent for just a minute. You can do things like you can brand your reports. You can add your own logos to them, like images, things like that, your own company colors. Essentially, adding an image to report is like any other HTML page. Your image tag and your source for your image. Generally, it's better to use some sort of image that's available out on a network server or on a company URL that you can pull that down. We've done that internally in Origin. We pull an Origin logo down, so that's possible. And if you'd like, we're working with reports and you need some help in how to do that, you can contact us. We're more than happy in OriginLab Tech support to help you with your reports. So back to the subject at hand. We have our style here. These are going to be blue, and it's pretty complex. I'm sorry that's the way it is, but that's what it takes. All right, let me come into my report, hit Control-M to go into the code mode, and I'm just going to come over to my CSS here and Control-A to select it all and Control-C to copy. You're going to take this code, this style code. You're going to go to the head element in your HTML. We're going to look for a style element, a style tag. And if you'll remember, I told you I had those that template for the HTML report kind of available for you. That template will have this style element already. I'll place my cursor or my caret right there in the middle of that style element. I'm just going to hit Control V to paste. And you can see I pasted those styles into my report. And once I render it, Control M, we can see how attractive the report is now. Okay, and as I say, I will attempt to put together a blog post very soon with additional styles for you to just copy and paste into your reports. All right, let's move to the last subject for the day, outputting reports. We have some options. We can either print to a printer, of course. We can print to a PDF, or we can export our report as a web page. And let's go back to our styling the report and just use this report for printing to PDF or for exporting. Now, one of the topics I want to bring up here is if you're going to be exporting a report, for example, to a PDF page, one of the things you need to pay attention to is you don't want to let any particular, for example, table elements to get really wide. Sometimes when they get really wide, we saw with a customer who had difficulty with this. If you let your table get really wide, it's not going to look good when you print it or when you create a PDF from it. So be aware, think in terms of keeping your HTML report kind of like the ratio of a normal page. So let's print this report to a PDF. We can do that by activating it, going to the File menu, choosing Print. And I want to find our driver, our PDF driver. Let me find that for a minute. Here we have Microsoft Print to PDF. I will select that driver. I will print. Origin, rather, the print spools up and it makes us select where do we want to save our report and what do we want to name it. Well, I've already got my location, so let me just call it my report. And the printer will automatically add the PDF extension. I'll choose Save. And let me take a look at how that looks. Open up my PDF rendering application. It happens to be the Edge browser by Microsoft. I just chose a default. And we can see we have a nice attractive PDF of our report. So that's how you would print to a PDF file. You can always, as I said, print to a printer. Now, let's look and see how we can export this report. We don't go to the File menu to export, as we did with the printing. We go to the title bar again in the report, this title bar. We're going to right-click, and our first option is to export to a web page. And when I do that, I have to select a folder to export to, and I need to give that a name too. This time, I'll also call that My Report. And save it. Let's come back and take a look at the final product. My browser, my default browser on my system is Firefox. We'll see how Firefox renders this report. Okay, so it comes in with a browser too. It looks very attractive. All right, we're going to wrap things up for today. Let's review what we've done. We looked at our intro, Origin's history of having reports and mainly coming from report worksheets, exporting report worksheets from workbooks, or creating reports in Microsoft Word. We looked at examples of reports, a Markdown and an HTML report. We looked at how Markdown and HTML syntax is. We reviewed adding graphs and tables. Remember, copy, paste, link. Adding cells, copy, paste, link. Adding variables. We just sort of have to learn what those variables are available from our documentation. And by the way, if you have questions about this, you can just contact us in tech support and we'll help you with that. We looked at, we looked at an analysis template. You have an analysis template. You want to do batch processing. We discussed how you have to embed or park that notes window into the workbook to make it that one self-contained unit for batch processing. We talked about how then when you do batch processing and save the intermediate books, each book will have its own report, dedicated report. We looked at using CSS cascading style sheets to style a report. Finally, we looked at outputting reports to a PDF file or a complete web page. I think we're done for today. I appreciate you listening and have a nice day.